Hi, world history students. Welcome to section 2 of the War and Revolution unit. This one is about the First World War proper. So, to kind of start this off, this is a German propaganda poster that was meant to affect public opinion on the German home front during the war. And so, if you remember the assignment that you did already on persuasion, which is the idea of pathos, logos, and ethos being ways of convincing people to take a side, the goal here is to get support for the German war effort. And the translation reads, if the enemies hate and army win, the workplaces will stand empty. Before closed doors, you'll have to tie up your bundles in hunger. So you've got an element of emotion here, unquestionably. You've got, look at all these folks. Here, let me get my pointer going. These folks in their sad faces outside the factory gates. If the enemies hate and army win. So you could argue that's, an example of fact. There's an army that's going to be, potentially fighting the Germans, but they're also trying to play with people's emotions by saying the enemy hates. Excuse me. And before closed doors, you'll have to tie up your bundles in hunger, trying to elicit fear of the enemy here as well. Got old style German lettering, which is supposed to make German people feel comfortable and look at it as something with authority and tradition. And the overall goal of this is to make it so the war effort isn't questioned and people support it and continue to sacrifice blood and treasure to continue it. So the focus question is, why were casualty rates so high in World War One, and why was the world surprised by this? So there's two parts. What made battle so deadly, and why didn't the countries involved know this was going to happen as they got into the war? And so a lot of this has to do with the assumptions folks had about what war would look like. So there was kind of two mutually contradictory presumptions that existed before 1914 that were shattered. So the two ideas were that war was going to be unthinkable because it would be so deadly. You have these militaristic imperial nations, your Germanys, your Frances, who have built up these giant militaries. So any war would be devastating. We can't have it. No war will happen because it's crazy. Obviously, that wasn't the case. They also thought that war, if it started rolling towards it, could be easily prevented because of the personal relationships and the civilized nature of all the Europeans involved. That also wasn't true. So there was this idea that war was devastating and also easy to avoid, and those both can't be true at the same time. The reason folks believe this stuff is because of the government propaganda in many countries. Most of the nations who were involved in World War One did not have what we call a free press. The government would censor news articles that were critical of the war effort, or maybe an opinion piece that said, hey, machine guns are going to make it so lots of people die if you try to charge them. And so there's this lack of truth getting out to folks. And in fact, an effort to convince every country that God was on their side and that their cause was just. So in 1914, when war does break out, in spite of these presumptions, there is a spirit of unbridled jingoism, which is militant nationalism, and a belief the war is going to be over by Christmas because, again, with that propaganda, the people of each of the countries have been convinced that they are the good ones and they're the best. They are the ones who are going to most easily succeed in this upcoming war because their enemies are degenerate. Otherwise, why would they be enemies? The other assumption, other than just kind of how easy the war would be, was an assumption on the German part in their Schlieffen Plan, which we looked at in the last section. The idea in the Schlieffen Plan was that the Germans would swiftly advance to the flat areas of northern France and Belgium, surround the city of Paris, capture it, knock France out of the war without much bloodshed, and then turn their armies, the Germans, to the Russians who would be attacking them in the east. Instead, the Germans were halted at the First Battle of the Marne. So this is really the beginning of the end of the assumptions and the start of the conditions for the trenches. So the First Battle of the Marne is a short distance from Paris. The Germans are there in their hundreds of thousands. The French army is fleeing. And then famously, 2,000 taxis are commandeered by the French military to shuttle troops from Paris to the battlefield. And the German assault was stopped because of the setting up of machine gun nests and mortar fire and early uses of gas warfare as well as the spotting by aircraft of weaknesses in the German lines by the French military. So the biggest assumption that makes it so the war is so deadly is that you're going to be able to assault enemy positions, which is something that was pretty typical in wars before this. But new technology, in particular the machine gun, had made defensive tactics, meaning defensive ways of fighting war, digging a trench, setting up a machine gun nest, waiting for the enemy to come to you, much, much more effective than attacking positions. In the Battle of the Marne, both sides set up trenches, both sides set up machine guns, and each side lost 250,000 people in casualties. And so that's 500,000 Germans and French were wounded in some way by this one battle, which took place over, I think it was 4 days, which is, yeah, there are, oh gosh, the city of Worcester, Massachusetts is roughly 250,000 people. And then the city of Springfield is 150,000. So if you took Springfield and its suburbs in the city of Worcester and everyone in those two cities got shot, that's the scale of what happened in the Battle of the Marne. You can imagine why somebody wouldn't want to relive this experience, or why the military commanders would say, hey, those are too high of casualties. And so the Germans retreat 60 miles from Paris, and a network of parallel, meaning, one facing the other, of defensive trenches with machine gun nests, barbed wire, the whole gambit. I'll show you a picture in a little bit. Were built from the English Channel, so right around the border of Belgium, all the way down the Franco-German border to Switzerland. So trench warfare, in a sense, is the result of expectations about war meeting reality. And the reality was much more deadly and much harsher than what the assumptions would have led the planners and the people of these countries to believe. Oh, this is a picture of French troops charging what is almost certainly going to be their inevitable deaths at the German lines in the First Battle of the Marne. This is a German piece of surrealist art by a gentleman named Otto Dix. And this is he was a soldier in the First World War. And these are actually German soldiers wearing gas masks with grenades in no man's land. You can see the blasted trees and the grasping hands of these very creepy paintings. So this is what the conditions in the trenches looked like in a sense. So in contrast to the Western Front, which is, again, trench warfare, really high casualty rates, there isn't really trench warfare on the Eastern Front. And this is largely a matter of geography. So the Eastern Front is between Germany, Austria, and Russia, effectively, because Russia is so huge. Russia is the beginning, or really what's in modern-day Poland, of what is called the Eurasian Steppe, which is a largely flat landscape that stretches from modern-day Poland all the way to Mongolia. And that's how the Mongol Empire was founded, the Huns, all that back in, you would have learned in Mr. Wall's class. At the battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes in the territory of East Prussia, the Germans basically put the Russians on the defensive for the rest of the war. So from September 1914 to about 1917, there's almost a constant German advance on Russian territory. And part of that is because of troops like this. These are cavalry troops, Germans, in gas masks, ready to charge across the flat landscape on the Eastern Plains. And they did, again, for 3 years of that war. Austria-Hungary, much less successful than Germany. They were beaten by Serbia when they tried to invade Serbia. And then they were beaten by the Russians. So even as the Russians are being defeated by the Germans a little bit north, are able to invade into these Polish and Ukrainian territories controlled by Austria. And then Italy, in May 1915, invades Austria from the south and starts crossing over the Alps. So Germany basically has to take over the war effort for Austria-Hungary starting in about 1915, which helps slow them down on the Western Front. And the casualty rates when the Germans get involved in pushing the Russians out of Galicia, again, that Austrian territory, is 2.5 million Russian casualties. So that's it for the Russians, more or less. They are constantly on the defensive on the Eastern Front as German cavalry and heavy artillery basically just push them back and back and back and back. So just to make it clear, the Russians lost World War I to the Germans, which maybe will help you when we look at World War II to see why Hitler made some of the decisions that he did. Serbia is finally conquered with the help of Bulgaria in 1915 as well. And again, the Eastern Front is a total German victory in every single battlefield. So, on the Western Front, the years of 1916 to 1917 are called the Great Slaughter. So, the image I have here, I'm going to skip a little bit further down, is of an image of the Battle of Verdun. And so, what is in the background is what they call the, oh gosh, I just lost it, the Holy Road. That's what it is. And so, or the Sacred Road, I'm sorry. And so, this is a caravan of supplies. You can see it stretching way off into the background to the troops at the Battle of Verdun. So why is this era considered the Great Slaughter? Well, part of what I want to draw your attention to is the scale of the battlefields here. So you can just see, again, all these supplies, that's bullets, that's food, that's uniforms, that's gas mask, that's helmets, whatever it might be. That's going to be consumed by troops and used. So you have just this massive, massive scale and almost a sense of, the trenches are becoming factories of warfare. They're pouring concrete, they have venting, electric lighting. So that defensive tactic of waiting for the enemy to rush at you into your machine gun nests becomes even more deadly and effective. So the war doesn't go from stalemate to just kind of staying at low casualty rates. The casualties actually go up. So you've got, again, searchlights, machine guns, barbed wire, artillery, trying to guard the landscape between the trenches. The high command had been trained of both armies to believe that all battles are won in great offensive attacks and breakthroughs, which means that they would use artillery to soften up the enemy soldiers in their trenches. In reality, what it would do was maybe kill some rats, maybe kill some soldiers, but most of the enemy would not actually be destroyed by the artillery because that's what trenches are meant to prevent. Then the troops would advance across the moonscape of no man's land between the trenches with bayonets fixed, and often would get mowed down, and by often, more times than not, would get mowed down by concrete-encased machine guns before they even had a chance to reach the enemy trenches. If they did reach the enemy trenches and occupy them, which was usually the goal, well, inconveniently, there were more enemy being transferred in with caravans like the Sacred Road here, and those trenches would often be taken back. So this Battle of Verdun, it lasts 10 months. 10 miles of territory are gained for the French, and over 700,000 casualties happen at this one battle between France and Germany for 10 miles of territory after, oh God, it was, this is 1916, so 2 years of people just dying in trenches. It's a tragedy. And the war becomes a war of attrition, which is basically a slow bleeding out of each of the enemy armies. The other theaters of the war are very different, again, than the Western Front. So we've got our Western Front, we've got an Eastern Front, we have the Italian Front between Austria and Italy, we've got the Balkan Front between Bulgaria and Serbia, and then we have what's called the Near Eastern Campaign. So this is all largely in the territory of the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottomans are considered by the other Europeans to be the sick man of Europe. They thought they could be easily beat up, divided, and conquered. Russia wants to get the city of Constantinople and annex the Bosphorus Strait so it can send its navy out of Black Sea. France and Britain want to take the Arabic-speaking areas of the Ottoman Empire and turn them into colonies. Greece wants the same areas that Russia does, and basically are convinced, the Greeks, that they should get the whole Ottoman Empire because of history involving the Byzantine Empire. So the Gallipoli campaign, which is right near the city of Constantinople, is seen to be an easy victory over a weak empire. Instead, the Australian and New Zealand's troops that are sent there by the British Empire have such high casualty rates that Australia and New Zealand start actually seeing themselves as separate nations. So, like, if you go to Australia and New Zealand, there's a holiday called Anzac Day, which is kind of the Memorial Day equivalent for those two countries, all because of how disastrous the attack on the Ottoman Empire was. So why is there Australia? Because of World War I. That Alpine Front I mentioned, largely a stalemate because it involved building iron ladders over the Alps. And that's not going to have a lot of troop movement. In imperialism news, there's Lawrence of Arabia here in this picture, who's a British officer who promises those Arab princes independence, which, if you're paying attention, you may note is different than what Great Britain itself wants, which is to annex the Arabic-speaking Ottoman provinces. So Lawrence gives promises folks like Abin bin Saud, who you may recognize the name of Saudi Arabia from, that they'll get independence if they just help destroy the Ottoman Turks. So the Arabs rise up, the British betray their promise, and after the war, but nonetheless, the Ottoman Empire collapses as a result of the British's efforts in Iraq and Egypt. So why does the U.S. get involved? You probably remember this from last year. It has to do with the sinking of American ships by German submarines, including the Lusitania pictured here. So that kind of gets American opinion to be against the Germans. The German High Admiral Halsendorf was correct in assuming that U-boats alone would not bring the U.S. into the war. And then, as you remember, the Zimmermann Telegram, which Germany promised Mexico lost territory that the U.S. had stolen if they declared war on the U.S., was seen as a declaration of war in itself by the United States. And so they declare war on Germany because of the interception of the Zimmermann Telegram. So how did the war impact the home front? So every country is slightly different. So many historians consider this war to be what's called a total war, which is a vocab word, by the way, in which all the resources, including people of a country, were mobilized to support the war effort. And this is true to greater and lesser degrees, depending on the country. A commonality, the use of propaganda. Every nation in the war used propaganda to convince folks to support the war effort. Every country saw an increase in government powers. If that was permanent or not depends on the nation. And there's a change in the role of women in every single one of the belligerent nations. And so, let's see, I'll get back to the women in a second. One of the ways that government power increased was in countries like the United States under Woodrow Wilson. There's what's called a planned economy, in which the government controls the production and sale of goods. This is also called socialism, and it's the first instance, really, in the US, for example, where this becomes an actual policy of the government. Propaganda, again, uses all the elements of rhetoric to try to persuade people. And in most of these nations, the unquestioning loyalty was demanded, and protest against the war was grounds for arrest. So, women in most of the countries involved in the war are able to get the right to vote as a result of it because of their, ability to do jobs they were deemed incapable of by some men who were just shocked when women turned out not to be incapable. So many countries try to roll back steps towards equality, but the gains couldn't be rolled back because of protests and demands by the women in these countries. So this is an image of women in France. It says up here in the translation, La Femme Nouvelle, the new woman, and this is the French are voters, except it's got the feminine version of the word the French. So La Française va voter. And so the opposition in the Senate is defeated. So politically, French women get the right to vote. I think it's in 1920, similar to the United States. So has the war impact the home front? Well, again, different degrees, but most importantly, it's a change in the status of women in these various societies.